Yo, recording begins. It is October 27th. This is ESM 105. All right, we're here in week 10. So in week 10, we're starting our ecological economics. This is just a 1-week PowerPoint, and then the next PowerPoint will be on human populations. You've got another quiz, quiz 4. It's due by November 2nd at 11:59 p.m., but it should be available now, honestly. I'm going to adjust the available from date because we've completed the PowerPoint, the week 7 through 8 PowerPoint that this quiz is on. So if you want to go ahead and get a head start on that, you totally can. It's got one question about stuff, the secret life of everyday things, and that will wrap up all of your assigned reading for the course. So yeah, just another reminder, don't forget, do your weekly discussions, and that you got the annotated bibliography, due date's still over a month away, but you want to be making regular progress on it. And if you want to drop by and talk to me about your annotated bibliography, have me give it a once over, or if you need some additional assistance in finding sources, I am happy to provide that assistance. Don't forget that I also have the annotated bibliography tutorial video shown on the homepage of your Canvas. All right, here we are. Are there any questions before we get into the material for today? Cool. Week 10, ecological economics. How do we value a landscape? Can you give a monetary value to the aesthetic beauty of this serene landscape? I challenge you to do so. And that's the challenge that ecological economics presents to all of us. Ecological economics is just a way of looking at the value, at intrinsic cultural aesthetic values of things, and trying to assign them a monetary value so that they sort of fit into the system, the world economic system. All right? And we'll talk about that. We'll have to go through a brief overview of economic systems. It's going to involve that we just briefly talk about, like, what's capital in capitalism and what's classical economics versus neoclassical economics. But I myself am not an economics professor, and I'm going to give you a very surface level overview of those topics. But it's interesting stuff, and it's a real rabbit hole to go down. Okay, so what is an economy designed to do? It's designed to manage resources, all right? The classical philosophy behind it is that you're trying to meet the needs of the most people in the most efficient way possible, all right? So we're also going to be talking about sustainable development, because if you're meeting the needs of the currently existing people, that does not mean that you're necessarily meeting the needs of future generations. So while development and continued progress and growth is considered as a necessity in neoclassical economics, right? The goal is to conduct that development in a way where future generations can also continue to develop. You see? So, when you're in economics, what are you talking about? You're talking about managing resources. What are resources? I really like this definition that I've put in quotes here. Any input used to create goods or services, because it ties together the systems discussion that we've been having since the first lecture, right? What's a system? A system has inputs, a system has outputs. There are state shifts or state changes of different variables within that system. Maybe a variable was a forest and now it's $10,000. It shifted states, you see? It's all a system. The system has inputs, the system has outputs, the system has throughputs, the system has externalities, the system has things that you want to internalize that were externalized. All of this language can be used generally in discussing all of these different fields of study. So economics deals with systems, Biology deals with systems. Ecology deals with systems. It's all about systems. So resources are inputs into a system. And what do they become? They become goods or services. So something physical that you can hold, a good, all right? You can also consider things like, sometimes you can also consider something like electricity a good, all right? But that's, not something that you should be holding. Or services, all right? You've got a resource, you exchange it for a service like cleaning your windows. I always go to cleaning your windows because there was a period of my life where that was my job. And it was, a service that people were willing to exchange goods for. And those goods originated as resources somewhere at some point, even though it may be far removed. Anyway, you've heard about these things like non-renewables and renewable resources. Let me go ahead. My laser pointer unexpectedly died, so I'm going to use the built-in laser pointer right there. It works, okay. So, non-renewable versus renewable resources. If after you use them, all right, they're the pool of the resources not being regularly replenished, we call it non-renewable. And if the resource is routinely being replenished, then we call it a renewable resource. So renewable resources, the big ones being sunlight, wind, okay, hydropower, all right? These things are renewable because the pool of power, even though you pull from it, it's constantly at a pretty steady state, or it's fluctuating, but it is not, the maximum level of the fluctuation in availability is not affected by your removal of the resource. So we've got the non-renewable resources, the classic example being fossil fuels. Even though it does renew technically, new fossil fuels are generated over long periods of time. The time period's so long, it doesn't renew in an appreciable rate to offset our withdrawals from it. Solid? And then you've got the intangible resources, open space, beauty, serenity, etc. All right? You can't burn it and make it move a car, all right? But it can move your heart. Very fun. We have a good time here in this class. Capital, okay? What is capital? So we've got a textbook definition from environmental science, which is any form of wealth available for use in the production of more wealth. But that's a pretty cyclical definition, and it's not super in line with economics, all right, with the definitions used in the field of economics. So I'm going to direct you again to the definition that I put in quotation marks here, which I'm just going to lazily read off of the slide. Here we go, but I'll do it with energy. Those durable produced goods that are in turn used as productive inputs for further production. So they're actual things, all right? It's a produced good, and you know that we can talk about capital. We usually are thinking about dollars, or stocks, or debt that you own, or property that you own. These things are all capital, okay? It's some good that can be exchanged and lead to further production, okay? It can be turned into other goods, other services. So when you say a form of wealth available for use in the production of more wealth, that definition also works most of the time, because you're like, oh, the land that I own is a form of wealth that I could turn into another form of wealth. But the form that wealth sits in is incredibly important. For example, if you own a farm, it's a lot of money in that land, but it's not a productive farm. You can have wealth that you are taxed on, but you don't have any actual income, okay? You have no money to pay those taxes with. And that's going to come up later when we talk about land easements, which I think or conservation easements, which I'm hoping everybody finds pretty darn interesting. All right, different forms of capital. Natural capital, resources, natural resources. Human or cultural capital. Knowledge and experience can be used to generate wealth in another form, right? If you know how to do carpentry, you know how to drive a forklift, that's knowledge that can be turned into capital of another form with the intermediate state of money, and then eventually into property, into a dog, all right? Manufactured or built capital. Things that actually you can touch, you can hold. You've got tools, homes, infrastructure, okay? All of these can also be used to develop more wealth. If you've got a bunch of roads developed, if you have a community built, if you have a suburb laid out, even if the properties aren't necessarily built, you've developed infrastructure there where now you can turn that into another form of wealth. People exchange their capital for your capital in the form of the infrastructure investment that you've already made. They build a house there on the land that they purchase, okay, and now they have a new form of capital, and part of it is reliant on the infrastructure capital that you initially had. Any intro economics class or discussion you have is a lot of, well, I know these things, I know this, it all makes sense, you're just using different words for it, you know, which can be a really standard, it's a standard feeling to get when you're reading through any of this stuff. So we're just getting used to the terminology of economics so that we can talk about ecological economics, okay? Because the thing is, we're still going to be talking in terms of resources and capital. We're just going to be talking about framing capital in different ways. It'll be interesting. So we've got, what's the capitalist system, okay? When initially established, the idea was you've got sellers that can freely sell. Nobody is coerced to sell anything. And you have buyers who are not coerced to buy anything. And they get to select from any of these sellers, all right? And they get to be informed. They are not misled about the things they are buying. And in a system like that, the buyers decide sort of what industry, what practices they deem acceptable, and the system moves forward, encouraging good actors on all fronts. Now, if the buyers are always truly well informed, that's a really big question. And what the buyers' values are and when they make a purchase, that's a big question. Because usually what's going on is there's a consideration of marginal costs and marginal benefits where it falls into how much capital can the seller realize, all right? What's the way to maximize the capital realized? And for the buyer, what's the way to maximize the benefit that I receive? Okay? I need a house with furniture in it, all right? Am I going to necessarily be aware of the materials used to build the furniture? And do I have the buying power to select the $10,000 set of furniture over the $500 set of particle board furniture? And to even take into account environmental considerations, okay? So, some of the key aspects of classical capitalism. The means of production are privately owned versus publicly owned. So producing the goods, extracting the resources, generating the certain forms of capital can all be done by private industry, okay? Private rather, as opposed to a public ownership. And we'll talk about how public ownership is utilized within this system in things like a land trust, which I think you might also find very interesting. Private property, all right? There is private property versus public property. People own the things and you have rights to utilize the things that you own, okay? And then wage labor, where you are given money for your work, and then you use that money to participate in the capitalist system. To earn a living, to buy goods, to exchange your labor time for other people's labor, or for goods, or for maybe just resources. Maybe you're just buying some logs, you know? Alrighty, cool. Now, this is a big consideration in ecological economics, is externalization of costs. Because maybe you've got well-informed buyers, all right? And maybe these well-informed buyers do care about the ecological impact of their purchases. You know, there's a lot to be said that in this system, your vote is really where you spend your money. You know, you get to really affect the system through how your money is spent and through who you endorse, larger companies, and then how they spend their money. But tracking all of that's very difficult, okay? And it becomes easier and easier in a global economic system to externalize costs. And then if you become a large enough entity, you can externalize more and more and more and more of your costs, okay? You generate waste, you ship it off, you ship it overseas, or you send it to a different state or something like that, as an example, okay? You need resources that current environmental regulations won't allow you to harvest within the state that you're trying to sell in. Well, you're a big enough entity that you can import the resources from an adjacent state, and therefore you're getting a way lower price point, and you outcompete anybody who's selling solid oak furniture in your state because you can't access it, all right? So you're externalizing these costs, or you're able to avoid regulation because of your size and buying power. So there's a lot of, you know, there's flaws. Classical economics, supply, demand. There's a supply of something, there's a demand for something. The market should reach equilibrium. That's what the establishing philosophers of classical economics said, that there will be, if there is a low availability of something, then the demand for it will be high, all right? If there's a high supply of something, then the relative demand, okay, will be, sorry. I gotta orient ourselves to this figure. Quantity of the good, low to high. Price of the good, low to high. As the supply goes up, the relative demand can go down, okay? And the price of the thing should also drop because there's so much of it. Reasonable things that you know about already. Supply and demand economics, okay? The system's meant to reach this stabilizing point where prices for a good get set because you've got enough of it, and the demand is meeting the supply and the demand are sort of equally balanced. If demand increases beyond the supply, then the prices can increase and the thing becomes less available. And then technologies change, or the market shifts and something different is used to produce the good, and now it's provided in a different way. All right? This works for all sorts of things, with energy, with coffee, with a thermos, okay? All these different things. Price elasticity. So some items have what we call price elasticity, or elastic prices, whereas other items do not have price elasticity. Some things, as the supply or demand changes, the prices shift to reflect that. Some things have constant prices. Usually, if the availability, if the supply can't be adjusted, but the demand can adjust, all right? But, so that can sometimes lead to an increase in price, all right? Enough people want it. But once the price reaches a certain point, people may want it but won't get it. You know what I mean? See what I'm trying to say here? So some goods have high price elasticity, some goods have low price elasticity. So if we've got these fundamental principles of economics that we're working with now, right? The question is, can we make a demand for conservation? Question. Yeah. My best examples are, examples are when there's a manipulation, like a market manipulation by government intervention. Okay, where like you cannot ramp up the price of this good any further because it's an essential good. So even though technically you could probably discharge more people for water, there's no price elasticity to that once the demand hits a certain point and the supply is at a certain point. Cool? Awesome. I love it. And I'm sure there are other examples, but that's the one that immediately springs to mind. And it's a pun because springs and water, we have fun. I'm establishing today that we have lots of fun here. Very good. Okay, cool. So here's the idea in ecological economics. Use these principles of these systems and introduce a new component. There's a lot of different ways to do it, and we'll talk about a few. But you want to make a demand for conservation principles. Like you want to create a demand from the market for goods that are produced sustainably. You've seen this huge boom, probably. I certainly have in my lifetime. I'm not sure, maybe it was probably a little more prevalent as you were becoming of buying age, where you saw things marketed as organic or made of recycled materials or produced in a sustainable way. I just bought a damn couch. You know how crazy that market is if you're trying to, incorporate any sort of environmental care at all. It just jumps you up from like a $200 couch to, like 5 times the price to get a little sticker on it that says that you're a good person. Now, really it's about, the actual impact, but that's my cynical outlook, which is not needed here. We've all got enough cynicism. Okay, cool. So how do we create that demand for conservation? And then how do we affect the supply versus demand of the aspect of a good that has something to do with its conservation implications? Because let's say that you start to produce, we're gonna use our example of carbon credits, okay? You start to produce this carbon market and these carbon credits, and then countries start to impose regulations on how many greenhouse gases industries can produce. And then they allow those industries to purchase carbon credits on a carbon credit market, okay? And then they can produce more greenhouse gases, but they're offsetting it by purchasing these carbon credits. Well, what have you done here? You've just created a high demand, okay, for carbon credits, because these industries still want to produce at a profitable rate, at a highly profitable level. They don't want to reduce production rates. So what's that going to do based on classical economics? It's going to ramp up the supply. The market's going to shift and provide and give a higher supply. So now you're going to have all of these new entities emerging that are selling carbon credits, and people are going to find new ways to generate carbon credits because you've made the carbon credits into a resource. And all of the classic philosophies of economics are going to come into play here. If the resource declines, people will find new ways to access the resource, even if the resource itself is a non-tangible thing. The carbon credit is a number that you click over to somebody. It's not a piece of paper even. See what I'm trying to say? Anyways, so here's an example of this is a pretty aggressive, not really free market or not really manipulating capitalism in this way. You're just talking about taxation to encourage conservation, okay? Government intervention to encourage conservation practices, all right? So we've got right here this 2008 example. British Columbia taxes all carbon fuels, all right? What does this do? It creates an incentive for industries to shift away from using carbon fuels. So while in other parts of Canada, carbon fuel use has increased, in British Columbia, fossil fuel use has actually decreased significantly, okay? Now, there are questions to be asked about how did this affect the industries that were using the fossil fuels. But from the conservation perspective, this is all a net benefit. Now, there are lots of things to consider. Did this adjust consumer prices for goods that were shipped in? All right? These are all things that you need to look into on an individual. I tried to get a good summary thing, but there's too much variability in the data set. It's wild. But if you look at this actual tax and on its very surface level, pretty beneficial. It's a revenue neutral tax, and that means that the money that is taken in from the fossil fuel tax is used to reduce other taxes. So the government doesn't actually keep that money. All right. The idea is that they say, oh, we've got this increase in income, in taxable income, or taxed income from taxes, okay? And so we're going to reduce other taxes by that amount. So in exchange, individuals and companies pay less in taxes to operate in British Columbia, and that helps to offset the increased costs due to reduced fossil fuel use. You see, the increased cost that industries have to deal with because they have to shift over their practices away from using fossil fuels into using sustainables because now those are more economically feasible. See what I'm saying? Okay. Now, the things to think about here, right? Look at where these tax reductions go. Oh, trivia thing, in Canada, BC has the lowest private tax rates, and to a large extent it's because of this, okay? So personal taxes, solid. Where do these tax reductions go? Personal tax reductions, low income tax reduction, targeted personal tax reductions. So these are specific groups, who may be low income groups, people with disabilities, etc., okay, who are in programs already that reduce taxes, they get more targeted personal tax reductions. Corporate taxes, boom, big portion. Targeted corporate taxes, boom, big portion, okay? And here's the thing right here. The government decides which industries receive the tax reductions from this imposed tax. So while the government is not taking that money and investing it directly or buying up land or getting more capital, what they are able to do now is to say, we want to shift towards renewable energy. So we will give tax reductions to renewable energy projects in this area. Do you see what I'm saying here? Yeah, please.
So the government is using taxes to reduce taxes?
Exactly. Yep. So you get a ton of tax revenue from taxing all the fossil fuels, all right? And then all that tax revenue is used to make up for the reductions in taxes over here. So these bars are supposed to balance out in the plan. They don't quite because, you got more reductions imposed than the revenue necessarily compensated for. They couldn't predict the future, how these numbers would work. The revenue is based on the actual use of fossil fuels in the area. Question? Yeah. Please elaborate on, yeah.
It slowly adds more and more and more, and it's never ending. You're getting less. It's taking stuff away from you, but you're still adding and adding.
Yeah, the goal is to make it really just depends on the perspective and also recognizing that things will change again, Like, it's a pretty significant price increase, these fossil fuel taxes, for anybody using fossil fuels. So that revenue is, pretty high just from these taxes, right? You describe, it's going to keep on building and building, right? The idea is more that this revenue will keep going down and down and down, all right? And then these tax reductions will need to go down and down and down and down as well. But that's going to be an issue, right? So if you get what you want, but you don't understand the reason for your reduced taxes was because of we have high fossil fuel use. Now you're going to see that in 10 years as, why are they raising my taxes? And where'd all these ugly wind farms come from? You see what I mean? It's a pretty standard sort of cycle right there. Yeah. So the idea is not to continue increasing revenue on fossil fuels or keep increasing taxation rates until you eventually make it a non-viable market entirely and just cause that to be removed that way. But it is something to consider, and especially points like this, like which industries are getting this money? Where does it all go? You know? Yes, please.
Is the amount of revenue generated by the tax, does that get allocated in tax reductions proportionately, or is it a set amount?
In the ruling, it is proportionately.
Okay.
All right? But it's not on a like year to year to year to year basis. So they impose these are going to be the tax reductions based on our projected income. And that's why you see these bars not leveling out. Because they would perfectly level out if it was like, hey everybody, this year we made $1,200 million, right? We made $1 billion. We're going to now portion that all out. But yeah, exactly. So it's an interesting way of doing this, you know? But there are arguments for conservation via taxation, and there are arguments against conservation via taxation. And other groups believe that it's better to create a market for conservation, which is what I'm going to talk to you about with the carbon credits. All right? Carbon markets. So this is kind of like using the phrase like free market solution is a loaded phrase, you know? But this is a market-based solution to carbon emissions, okay? To greenhouse gas emissions. It deals with a lot of aspects, all right? You try to get this big umbrella term of how much carbon do you emit into the atmosphere, because it catches a lot of things. It catches like fossil fuel burning, it catches in other industrial processes that produce greenhouse gases, it captures deforestation. All of these things, okay, can all be gauged based on carbon emissions. So talking about carbon emissions is just a nice way to simplify negative environmental effect, all right? And it's also sort of a good umbrella. Like, remember the umbrella species, where if you protect this species, it protects a lot of habitat and therefore other species. Well, if you monitor and limit carbon emissions, then you're also reducing other negative environmental effects, all right? Because if you adjust your system to reduce less carbon, you have to, for example, update it and upgrade it. And when you're updating and upgrading this is all, I know this kind of gets a little, out there, but like you make it so you can't emit past a certain amount of carbon. Now the industry has to update. Now that it's updating and putting in any new equipment or materials, that new equipment has to meet modern standards for things besides just how much carbon they emit, because they can't sell the equipment, they can't buy the equipment that isn't green, or greener, let's say. You see, so you're capturing a lot beyond just it. What I'm trying to say to you is that it's not just CO2 going into the atmosphere that we care about, but monitoring outputs of carbon is something that we can do, and by limiting that output by a project or by an industry, you can catch a lot of other negative environmental impacts. I got all the way back to the beginning. Did that make some sense? Yeah, okay, cool. Let's focus in though, we'll dial in on carbon credits. I think it's a pretty standard question to have, like, why do we care so much about just the carbon cycle? Aren't there other important ecological cycles that we've been talking about? But I'm just trying to catch up on why this is a good thing to focus on. Okay, I don't have a clicker today, that's right. Carbon credits, yes? Yeah, that's a really good question. Okay, so there are these entities, the carbon crediting programs, and here's how it works. I am setting up a coal mine. I am allowed to produce this much CO2 into the atmosphere each year, but I actually produced twice that much this year. So what do? Bless you. I can either be shut down, face fines, or I can effectively say, those people over there emitted half of the CO2 that they were allowed to emit. What if I give them some money and say, I'm going to buy those credits, all right? So another coal mine down the road, they did it better. And they could have emitted 1,000 tons, but instead they emitted 100 tons, all right?
Kind of like there's a certain amount of credits allocated in general, and then whoever's in a surplus can buy from those who are in a deficit.
Yeah.
Kind of like a steady state of carbon credits, but you can just buy and exchange within each other.
Yes, and each industry's output, or each independent project's output, is going to be determined by its size as well. So it's not just that overall, all of the coal mining in Connecticut can only emit this much carbon. It's more that each coal mine per unit area can emit this much carbon. And if one coal mine emits much less than expected, then that's implying they invested money, they invested capital into reducing their emissions. They should be able to realize profit from that.
Got it.
See?
And that
Yeah.
comes from essentially
That company over there that didn't update and didn't do it in a sustainable way, now they have to buy those credits from somewhere.
as opposed to getting potentially from the government having to pay the government.
Yeah, they get fined, they get shut down, you know.
Got it.
Yeah. So that's the idea here.
So it incentivizes industries by using that industry as a way of you getting money. Also, is it intra-industry? Like, is each industry have its own? Can you only sort of buy from one industry?
So the carbon crediting programs, you can buy carbon credits from other groups. Like, let's say that I'm a coal miner. All right, I built a big coal mine. I don't actually do any of the mining. That's for other people. But I supervise. You know, you can tell because of my glasses. I'm a supervisor. So I'm supervising this coal mine. I could purchase carbon credits as long as they are approved by the government body that's imposing my regulations. As long as they approve the carbon credits, I could buy them from forestry individuals. Even if you own forest land, you can turn that forest into partially carbon credits by promising not to deforest that land for a given period of time. And then you can sell those carbon credits on the carbon credit market. But carbon credits are carbon credits, except that they have different quality, okay? So there's this group here, International Carbon, I think is what they're called. This is one of many groups that now exists to monitor the quality of carbon credits. So it's exactly like, it's kind of fun to talk about a little bit. Yeah, it's exactly like how debt, right? We've talked about debt a lot because that's the new market, right? Is people own your debt, people own my debt, and our debts are valued as high quality or low quality debt. It's like, based on my age, I'm a little older and I have a higher degree, so I probably have, on paper, my debt is worth more. There's a higher likelihood that they can seize my assets and get more of that money back. But a student's debt is a lower quality debt unless it's from a student loan. But like student credit card debt is a low quality, low value debt. Same thing with these carbon credits, right? Some carbon credits are considered high quality carbon credits where it looks like, oh, these actually have a benefit that's going to be long lasting. And some carbon credits are low quality carbon credits where it's like, that's in an area that is regularly undergoing changes in governance, it's undergoing changes in regulation. Or let's say that this big concept here of additionality is very interesting. If you're like, well, I'm gonna say that the National Forest Reserve over there, I want those to be carbon credits, and I promise that we won't make it not a National Forest Reserve. That doesn't really have any additionality because it was already going to be a carbon sink. The carbon wasn't going to be freed up ever. So that's like a low quality carbon credit, and therefore certain governments won't let an industry purchase those carbon credits to offset their carbon emissions. It's pretty wild stuff. No problem. I want to click this link. This should be a link. Oh, so for the yeah, absolutely. A high quality example would be, okay, we're in California. I'm Apple now. Here I am. Hello. You're welcome for all of the things that I've done for you. I'm Apple. I just bought 10,000 acres of forest land, and I am putting it I'm putting a conservation easement on it with an entity that's been established for 50 years, a conservation group, and has a track record of not developing or selling land. They exist only as a nonprofit entity to manage land that has been given to them and prevent development. So I bought all that land, and then I give it to them, and I remove my entire stake in it, okay? Now, that in exchange, I get carbon credits. And these are high quality carbon credits because that land, let's say in addition, it was going to be farmland. Somebody else was bidding on it to make it farmland. We say that, okay, the government's relatively stable, all right? We say that let's actually bounce over to the slides here. We say the government's relatively stable. There's going to be plenty of tracking and transparency available. We're going to be able to see what's going on there. My laser pointer's not working. We've also, in developing those carbon credits, you've given the money to a land trust or to a conservation trust, okay, that exists only to monitor its quality and give regular reports. And they've existed, that's high quality, right? There's high additionality because that land was going to be farmland, which would have, led to a huge carbon emission. There's permanence in that the land trust has been up there for a long time, and in my agreement, they say that they will never develop it, all right? There's quantification of emission reductions and removals, because we can look at other projects and say how much carbon would have been emitted by the farm being established there. There's no double counting, you don't sell it again, and then, this stuff these aren't really as relevant, but you see how that's a high quality. Yes. Yeah. So it's case by case and not really industry by industry. The idea is to make an entire new carbon trading market. But then the demand, here's the real problem. The demand is entirely contingent on, can I count these carbon credits against my emissions in the state where I'm operating? And do I even need to participate in the carbon market if I move to an area where there's no cap on my emissions? All right, so these are the big questions about how does a carbon market actually operate. You need to have some incentives for actually operating in the area, right? That's being governed, Because if you operate outside of that area, then all that the organization or the government trying to cap the emissions can do is not allow you to sell products in their state, you see, or impose additional fees when those products are moved into your state. It gets so complicated. Yeah, we have hit the end of our time, but we will come back to carbon markets again on Wednesday, and we will, we got plenty to talk about there. And then we're going to get into conservation easements and community land trusts, and oh, it's going to be a good time. Thank you all for being here, and I'll see you again on Wednesday. Thank you.